Hey everyone, and welcome back to Steady Hustlin'. Today we're going to do long division part 2. We're going to do some harder long division problems. So let's just get right into it, shall we? Alright, so in this question, we're going to find out how many times does 16 go into 5,568. Now this question's a little bit harder because instead of dividing by one number, we actually have two digits in our denominator, which makes it a little bit more complicated, but still pretty easy if you just follow these simple steps that we've been going through in the first long division video, the intro to long division, and we're going to continue it right here. So if we're asking ourselves how many times does 16 go into 5568, we have to write it out properly in math so we can start doing the steps of long division properly. So one way to write this is 5568 over 16, or 5568 divided by 16, or write it as 16 and then our division symbol, which is something like that, and then our numerator, which is 5568. So now that we have it set up, we can just start using long division to solve this problem. So the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is how many times does our denominator, 16, go into the first digit of the numerator, which is 5. So the answer is 0, because 16 is bigger than 5. So we're just going to go ahead and write 0 as the first digit of our answer. And then the second step is to multiply the denominator, which is 16, by the number we just wrote down. So 16 times 0 is just 0, right? And we're going to write that digit right here, underneath the first digit. And then what we're going to do is subtract the 0 from the 5. And the answer is 5, because 5 minus 0 is 5. The next step is to bring down the next digit, which is 5. And now we have to ask ourselves, how many times does 16 go into 55? These are just the simple steps of long division. We went over it last time, and we're going to continue to do that here. So 16 goes into 55 3 times. Now, one thing that I like to do to make these long division problems a little bit easier, if you're just a beginner in math, is to write down the multiples of 16 so that you can quickly figure out how many times 16 goes into 55, for example. So 16 is a nice number because if you ever played Minecraft, you probably already know the first 4 multiples of 16 just off the top of your head. So we have 16, 32, 48, 64, 72, or sorry, not 72, 80, and 96. So these are the first 6 multiples of 16. And as you can see, 16 goes into 55 3 times. So we're going to write that up here as the next digit of our answer. Now the next step is, just like we did last time, is to multiply 16 by 3. And since we have the multiples of 16, we know that 16 times 3 is 48. So we're just going to write that down underneath that number. And what we're going to do is subtract 48 from 55, and we get 7. Now the next step is, after subtracting, we bring down the 6. So now we just have to figure out how many times does 16 go into 76. And since we wrote down the multiples of 16, we know the closest number that's bigger is 80. So 16 goes into 76 only 4 times because 80 is bigger than 76. So 16 actually goes into 76 4 times. So we're going to write that down as the next digit of our answer and then multiply 16 by 4, which is 64. So 64, then we're going to subtract 64 from 76, and the answer is 12. And we still have one digit left to subtract in the numerator, which is 8. So we're going to bring that down, just like we did the last couple times. And now we just have to figure out how many times does 16 go into 128. And the answer is going to be 8 times. And we know that because 16 goes into 64 4 times, and 128 is twice as much as 64. So that's just a quick way to kind of figure out how many times 16 goes into 128. So the final step, obviously, is to multiply 16 by 8, which is 128. And then we just subtract these and we get 0. So nice. We actually have no remainder. So 16 goes into 5,568 348 times. So we can write that out as 5568 divided by 16 equals 348. And we have no remainder, so we don't need to write that down. Okay, so now that we did that problem, we're going to move on to this one. And this one's a little bit harder because the 32 going into 4207 is going to give us a remainder because 4,207 is an odd number and 32 is an even number. So to start us off here, I've actually written down the first few multiples of 32 so that it's easier to figure out how many times 32 goes into a given number. So the first step is to write out our division statement. So we're going to write it out as 32. Then we're going to write our division statement, which looks kind of like that. And then we're going to write 4207 inside there. So it's important in long division to, kind of keep everything lined up so that you don't lose track of what you're doing. So we're going to emphasize that on this question. Okay, so the first step is to figure out how many times does 32, which is our denominator, go into 4, which is the first digit of our numerator. So 32 goes into 4 0 times because 32 is bigger than 4. So we're going to write 0 on top of the 4. Then we're going to multiply 32 by 0, which is 0. And we're going to write that 0 underneath the first digit, which is 4. And then we're going to subtract the 0 from the 4. So 4 minus 0 is just 4. Now the next step is to bring down the 2, and we get 42. So now we're going to figure out how many times 32 goes into 42, which is once. Because if you look at the multiples of 32, 64 is bigger than 42, so 32 only goes into 42 one time. So now we're going to multiply 32 by 1, and we're going to write that down underneath the 42. So 32 times 1 is obviously 32, and then 32 minus 42 is 10. Okay, so now in long division, you want to remember that every time you subtract a number to bring down the next digit of the numerator. So we just did 42 minus 32, and we got 10. So now we have to bring down the next digit, which is 0. So now we have to figure out how many times 32 goes into 100. And the answer is 3 times, because 32 times 3 is 96. And we know that since we wrote down the first few multiples of 32. So 32 goes into 100 3 times. So we're going to write that down above the next digit. And we're going to multiply 32, which is our denominator, by 3. So 32 times 3 is 96. We know that from our numerator list. And we're going to subtract 96 from 100. And the answer to 100 minus 96 is 4. Now the next step, since we just subtracted, is to bring down the next digit of the numerator. So we're going to bring down the 7. So now we have to figure out how many times does 32 go into 47. And the answer is it only goes into 47 one time. Now the next step is to multiply 32 by 1, which is 32. And then subtract these two numbers, and we get 8 plus 7, which is 15. So that is our final answer. 32 goes into 4,207 131 times with a remainder of 15. So we can write that out like this. 4207 divided by 32 equals 131 with a remainder of 15. The first two problems of this video were dividing a 4-digit number by a 2-digit number. But what if you have higher digit numbers? Like what if you have a 5-digit number divided by a 3-digit number? So the process is pretty much the same, but I'm going to show you a little trick to kind of speed things up. Okay, so the first step of this problem is obviously to write down our division statement. So we have our denominator on the outside, then we write our division symbol, and then we write our numerator, which is 3, 8, 5, 3, 5. So remember how in the last few problems we were trying to figure out how many times does the denominator, which in this case is 125, go into 3? And then obviously it's 0 because 125 is way bigger than 3. Then we write a 0 above the 3, then multiply 125 by 0, which is 0, then subtract it. Well, we can actually just skip all of that, and we can move to the third digit, or we can try and fit 125 into the smallest number that we possibly can. So like, notice how if we tried to figure out how many times 125 went into 38, it would still be 0. But if we wanted to figure out how many times if we wanted to figure out how many times 125 goes into 385, it would be more than 0. It would be like once or twice or maybe 3 times. We can figure that out. But you kind of know what I mean. We want to try and fit the denominator into the biggest number possible in the numerator. So let me show you what I mean. So in this case, 125 goes into 385 3 times. And what we can do to speed things up in this question is write down the first few multiples of 125. So we have 125, 250, 375, and 500, and then 625. So that's the first 5 multiples of 125. And as you can see, 125 goes into 385 3 times. All we have to do is we write the 3, which is how many times 125 goes into 385, above the last digit that we kind of put the denominator into. And then what we can do is basically just the same process that we were using before. We want to multiply the 125 by 3 and then subtract it from 385. So now what we're going to do is multiply 125 by 3, which we already know is 375 from our multiples of 125. Then we're just going to subtract these two numbers. So 385 minus 375 is 10. And since we subtracted, the next step is to bring down the next digit of the numerator. So we're going to bring down the 3 and then try and figure out how many times 125 goes into 103. And the answer is obviously 0 because 125 is bigger than 103. So we're going to write that above here. We're going to multiply 125 by 0, which is 0, and we're going to subtract those two numbers. 103 minus 0 is 103. Since we subtracted, we're going to bring down the next digit of the numerator, which is 5. And now this is where our multiples are going to come in handy, because now we need to figure out how many times 125 goes into 1035. So we can keep writing down the multiples of 125 since we're not there yet. So the next multiple is 750. The next multiple past 750 is 875. And the next multiple is 1000. Then after that, it's 1125. So now that we have the first couple multiples of 125, we can figure out how many times 125 goes into 1035. And the answer is it goes into it 8 times because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that means that 125 multiplied by 8 is 1,000. But 125 multiplied by 9 is 1,125, which is bigger than 1,035. So 125 goes into 1,035 8 times. So we can write that above, and then multiply 125 by 8, which is 1,000, and then we could subtract these two numbers. And since we subtracted, we can bring down the next digit of the numerator, but there is none. So that means that this is our final answer. So the answer to 38,535 divided by 125 is equal to 308 with a remainder of 35. Alright, so I hope the examples that I went through in the last two videos were helpful to making you understand how to do long division. Now, if you're more of a kind of systematic learner, then pause the video and take a screenshot of these steps, and then you can try using these steps to do your long division homework. Now, if you have any questions or comments or concerns or anything, just leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to get back to you. Now, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.